In the previous session, we explained the hermeneutical nature of biblical texts themselves. In this session, we'll show how doctrine and the history of doctrine can also be seen as a result of a hermeneutical process. And that will enable us to move in the next session to the basic components of communication. If we look at doctrine, and that is a theological category on its own, the suggestion has been made, especially by Thistleton in his book, The Hermeneutics of Doctrine, that each of these pieces of doctrine or specific areas of theology can also be interpreted as the outcome of a hermeneutical process. What does this mean? It means that every piece of doctrine had a process of interpretation that consisted of two parts. The one is to collect throughout the Bible anything that has to do with that specific topic, whether it's creation or salvation or Christology. So the normal hermeneutical procedure is to collect all these references, wherever they occur in the Bible, bring them together, and then to systematize them in a sort of a framework that is logical and theologically sound. And you have many examples of how this body of doctrine took on a life of its own and became an in itself. The first would be Augustine's on Christian doctrine, where he collected all these insights about what the essence of the Christian message would be and forms in this document. Very famous is, of course, Thomas Aquina's Summa Theologica, which is again his summary of the essential points of theology as he understood them and he documented. And that became a very powerful framework in the Roman Catholic tradition that till today determines in many ways the education and the training of priests. Ask any of your Roman Catholic colleagues and you'll discover how the influence of Thomas still is felt today. Now, John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion is something similar, which has become a theological handbook. But that handbook does not come out of the Bible as such. It is Calvin's own exploration of themes, his systematization of that, building a whole system on its own. But perhaps the most famous of these systems is the Kirchliche Dogmatik, or the Church Dogmatics of Karl Barth, the Swiss theologian. That has almost become an impenetrable edifice and a bulwark that you can only enter into and join if you follow his premises and share that. So it's a quite remarkable collection of his interpretation of what the gospel really means. And so we can take many other examples of these collections of bodies of doctrine in the form of a logical enclosed system. A very specific form of the history of doctrine is the form of a confession. And throughout the history of the church, we have this collection and sequence of confessions, the Apostles' Creed, Nicaea, the Reformation, and so it goes on. Now, each of these creeds or confessions has a certain historical context in which produced that confession. And often it was a theological issue that lay at the heart of that interpretation. An issue that was felt at the time that this is really crucial to the gospel as a whole, and therefore it had to be interpreted or restated in a very specific way. And therefore confessions have this character of a cri de coeur, of a cry from the heart in this very specific positions. Now, if we look at the example of Luther, what moved him more than anything else was, quite apart from other differences he had with the Roman Catholic Church, was this conviction that what he called the living word, and that was also in his theology in distinction from the written word, the living word that was being suffocated by tradition and the authority of the church, and therefore no longer to speak freely and to act as the source of life and of theology as it should. So that was the core of his protest, was this hermeneutical priority of the living word. And therefore sola scriptura is so typical of the Lutheran approach, followed by the other solas of sola gratia and sola fide, only through grace and only through belief. So what we are dealing with in confessions is not the complete statement of the Christian faith, but a very specific issue that is under threat. In the case of the Bekennende Kirche, it was a church under threat from the government of the day, and that was the Nazi government, to become Deutsche Christen, German Christians, to become a nationalist church with an Aryan principle. And that Aryan principle was an attempt to clean or cleanse the church from non-Aryan elements, which was just a code for Jewish elements. So the attempt was to limit membership of the church to people who were clearly not of Jewish descent, and secondly, to bring this under control of the government of the day, the Reichsbischof that Hitler himself appointed, and therefore become really the dominant authority as far as the church is concerned. The Bekennende Kirche protest was on this point, protesting against the secular government taking over the church and prescribing of who belongs to the church or not. Now maybe the most telling one in our own history is the Bellar Confession, which you have the text in your reading and also the so-called accompanying letter, and which has a very interesting history of its own, which I cannot discuss here in detail. What makes it so interesting is that the whole Bellar Confession is driven by a hermeneutical insight. And that is already stated as basis for the so-called status confessionis, the reason why it is seen as a moment of confession. And that is the denial in advance of the reconciling power of the gospel. Now, what is at play here? Bellar has the conviction that the church comes into being because people are reconciled with God and therefore reconciled with each other. So the church is a body of reconciled people. And this reconciliation is made possible by the work of Christ and by the establishment of the church. And if you read both the confession, the Bellard Confession, and the letter, you'll find that the concept of confession appears 6 times in the confession, 5 times in the letter. And this is really the hermeneutical key to the whole Bellard Confession. So the protest is the denial or the acceptance that people cannot be reconciled in principle. Therefore, it's better to keep them apart, to have separate churches, to divide the church along racial lines, etc., etc. And the protest from the side of Bellard is exactly to re-establish this fundamental hermeneutical insight. So we could conclude this session by saying even confessions, although they are not biblical documents, have this nature of being, in essence, a act of hermeneutics, an hermeneutical act where an insight coming through interpretation and understanding becomes the basis of a confession.